these small businesses, they're receiving these questionnaires, especially on the cybersecurity side, these cybersecurity assessments, and they come in a whole bunch of different formats and styles. We've seen, some that are, 30 questions long in an Excel. We've seen some that are, 150 questions long. I spoke with a 200-person business the other day who said that they received one that was hundreds of pages long.
When you receive one of those assessments, you have a few options that are available to you.
A manufacturer that I met with who was explaining to me that one of their vendors, who was also a manufacturer making a piece of equipment that they included in their stuff, was hit with ransomware, and that actually infected their entire plant. And so this vendor they used was shut down for weeks.
Hey everybody, it's Rob Simopoulos and welcome to another episode of The Hilt. Today I'm excited about my conversation with Justin Riehl. Justin's got 20 years of experience in GRC, and for those who don't know what that stands for, it means governance, risk, and compliance. Justin's a third-party risk professional, and he's the managing principal at CastleHill Managed Risk Solutions. We're going to get deep in the weeds today. We want to understand how enterprise organizations are looking at their small business vendors from a risk perspective. Should be really, really interesting. Jumping into it now.
CastleHill Managed Risk Solutions, we provide companies large and small with advisory services and products and processes aligned to GRC, right? So GRC is government risk and compliance. Sometimes it's synonymously referred to as integrated risk management. And we participate in enterprise level process development, process support, technology implementations. But I think just as often these days, we're being called in to solve some very specific problems aligned to compliance overhead of some kind. Where I reference process support, I'm referring to our GRC as a service line where we perform various risk assessments on our clients' vendors on their behalf, sometimes as few as 10 a month and other times as many as several hundred a month for individual clients. So we're very busy in the third-party risk management space.
Great. And tell us how long have you been at CastleHill, and what was your experience before that?
I've been at CastleHill for 5 years, but worked with most of the folks at CastleHill for better than 15. Overall, I have 20 years of risk and compliance experience, primarily around government, financial services, insurance, manufacturing, pretty broad application. And that's everything from large enterprise implementations down to small line of business implementations.
Fantastic. All right. So here's the big question, because I think a lot of the people who are listening here might not even know what this necessarily involves, but in a short outline, tell me, what is a risk assessment? What's a risk assessment, and what are these folks doing?
In the context of third-party risk management?
Even just starting at an enterprise organization, if you walked into one of your customers today and you began taking them through a risk assessment, what are you actually trying to accomplish there?
Okay, so when we take a look at risk, the risk assessment is a process generally driven by a questionnaire or a spreadsheet or some format presented to a company's organizations or vendors, like a line of business that would be internal, or a vendor externally that seeks to understand what the internal functions or products or services that are being managed, to understand what they introduce into the organization in terms of risk overhead. So that overhead may be technology or data protection, could be a compliance concern, basic operational risk, the day-to-day activities, business as usual. A lot of times, if you're doing a risk assessment internally or even externally, that risk assessment can be driven by some type of a regulatory or compliance requirement. But at the end of the day, what they really want to know is what policies, procedures, and protections are in place, either internally or externally, and whether or not those policies and procedures protect the company's best interests, I think. And that's why you do the risk assessment.
And when you guys go at that, in most cases, are you starting, and most of the time, looking at the organization internally, and then from there moving outward to the external organizations they're doing business with?
Well, you want to you want to take a look at things internally, because that generally drives anything that will happen externally. But yes, we take a look at what risks they've identified. We try to understand their control environments, understand what they have in place to mitigate risks that they understand, or that they've uncovered, and then we take a look at how those risks that they understand are being introduced to them from external sources. And that's where we start getting into things like vendors and what do they bring into the organization and how do you have to handle them.
So Justin, in order to do that, especially for a larger organization, there's obviously a consulting practice around that, but is there technology that you utilize to help with that as well?
There is technology, but risk assessment at its core is a process with defined expectations around an outcome. A lot of times, if we're looking at technology is where you go to either support that process, right? Do things like penetration testing and that type of thing. And it's also an opportunity to collect data and hold it in a state where it's useful going forward. Things like, if you deploy a technology, for example, to take a look at your InfoSec risks, or to measure outside influence, or to show what you've done in terms of vulnerability and penetration testing. I'm just using technology as an example. Then a platform is a much better place to keep that information than is a spreadsheet.
Sure.
Yeah.
Are you seeing specific industries perform these types of risk assessments more in one area than another, or is it? I know you mentioned compliance. Is it mainly compliance driven? What are you seeing?
So always at the forefront is financial services, because they have such a heavy burden in terms of regulation and compliance. But now what you see is that states and the federal government understand that financial services aren't the only source of potential issues. And so now a lot of the same cyber rules, for example, the same types of assessments that take a look at things like privacy and compliance and CFPB matters, that type of thing, they're starting to apply to a lot more than just financial services. If you take a look at some of the state and local regulations being enacted, if you take a look at New York, California, Nevada, Massachusetts, Washington State, the list just keeps growing and growing. And where it used to be very specific to financial services, now it extends to manufacturing, marketing, pharma, right? Healthcare always, but healthcare now more than any time in the recent past. So there's a lot out there.
It's so interesting because going away from just it's not just HIPAA compliance and the compliance side, it's regulation, and then even coming from like the EU with GDPR and the whole bit as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, it extends. That's a good point. So it's also not just domestic regulation and compliance. A lot of it has to deal with how you deal with folks you're interacting with overseas, and that's a piece that folks are just starting to get their hands around and starting to tackle. So yeah, all very important.
I think it'd be interesting for the smaller organizations to understand who's actually involved in an enterprise organization when they go through the risk assessment. Like who's in the room, who's on that team, who's helping go through that. I'm sure there's a large number of team members from the end user organization who's involved in that, and then there's specific people who are involved in compliancy and so forth. Who do you see at the table usually?
Well, you'll always see the audit function if there is one, right? So if you're in a larger organization, I'm not talking about SMBs or anything like that, but in large organizations, you'll typically have an audit function that's very active, and they will be in the room taking a look at different types of documentation, history records. They'll take a look at logs, for example. They will perform interviews on line of business, leadership, right? Managers, senior managers, and the folks on the front line who are, participating in these organizations and are really very customer facing. So you'll see that type of a risk assessment where you're saying, well, how do we do things today, and are they being done professionally and completely. That's one type of risk assessment, again, where you're looking internally. Externally, when you have folks at the table, now you're looking at something a little bit different. If you have a risk assessment that is dealing with outside influences like vendor introduced risk or pandemics, right? Earthquakes and all types of risks that are out there, including competitive risk. Now the audience is, can be quite different in the room, and mostly it speaks to those folks who are involved in your control environment and what they see as the large risks and the mitigations that need to be brought on board. So,
Excellent.
yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Let's dive right into that for a second. It's so interesting. So these enterprise organizations are performing risk assessments internally and externally. There's a number of different things that they're looking at, but one of the things that we're seeing for sure with small organizations is what we call this third-party vendor assessment, where these large enterprises are looking at these smaller organizations that they do business with, and then starting to, especially on the cybersecurity side, trying to understand, what they look like. Do they have proper protections in place? Why is that occurring? In your opinion, I think I know what your answer is, but are these smaller organizations a threat or a risk to these larger entities?
Well, they can be a threat to the larger organizations, not through negligence of any kind, but just because they're operating in environments where a lot could go wrong. And generally speaking, it has more to do with human error than it does any type of, criminal behavior. So they want to understand those external organizations, mostly because the government, in a lot of cases, and for good reason, tells them that they have to do this, at least on some level. And also, I think when we're talking about large, public companies, I think because they have a duty to, their customers and shareholders to commit some level of due diligence, again, ensuring that their best interests are preserved. And you do that by talking to the vendors and understanding what could go wrong. What's the potential? That's why they do that.
I've spoken to a lot of smaller organizations, and it's interesting when you start the conversation about, going through data classification and trying to understand, what data do they store about their customers, where do they store it, how do they protect it? Quite often, there's an awareness challenge where they immediately go like, we don't store credit cards, we're good, our customers are safe. But, there's a lot more data that they're obtaining from their customers than just credit cards. If you think about, perhaps an IT provider who's going into a customer site to maybe deploy networks or technology, or a systems integrator, they have floor plans showing, these facilities. Sometimes they're not necessarily classified, but high security facilities, and they get these blueprints. They also have network topology. They get MAC addresses and IP addresses and so forth, and that's just sort of skimming the top. There's definitely a lot of data that needs to be protected by these smaller organizations. Would you agree with that?
I would, and you bring up a good point. Sometimes it's not just the one thing that you share with a single vendor. It's a risk is a problem of accumulation, right? So you have a lot of that information that's out there. It's in different hands. It's being shared in different ways, and an organization has to know how that information that they're providing to their vendors is being leveraged. Where are they sharing it? What are the protections involved? Are the constituents, adequately trained in preserving the integrity of that information, right? Do they have that technology training? Do they understand when, even down to the most basic level, not only are we talking about things like entitlements and making sure that it's protected on a technological level, but also understanding when an email comes into your organization that isn't legitimate, right? Again, that's where companies want to understand that their vendors have those basic protections and training in place to protect their information. It is a cumulative problem, as you mentioned, all those things brought together.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And so when an enterprise organization goes through a risk assessment and they're trying to identify which vendors specifically, they want to do an assessment on, do they just send that out to everybody, or are they picking specific ones based on, the risk analysis that's completed?
Yeah, you shouldn't send it to everybody. You'll just make a lot of enemies if you do that. So there's actually there's a process that needs to be put in place that categorizes and segments your data, your vendor population, and typically you do that through some type of an inherent risk assessment, which is done internally. Generally, they're fairly small assessments that are provided internally to a subject matter expert of some kind who deals with the vendor, and they'll take a look at what the technologies are involved, if they're sharing data, what's the nature of the data being shared, the classification. They'll understand if the product or service being provided is, for example, a SaaS or PaaS solution, or if it's on-site software, if it's a technology solution, or if they're consultants, what's the level of the data that they'll be granted access to in the organization. So once you get all this information collected, and really large companies should be doing, even small companies should be doing this, because it gives you a pathway to understand how you have to deal with your vendors on a go-forward basis. And what you'll realize is that out of your 100 vendors, there are 10 who are really potentially problematic, and probably another 30 or 40 that you have to evaluate on some level, again, to make sure that your best interests are protected. And then there's a handful where you can say, well, we really don't have to do anything with these folks because they don't have access to any sensitive areas. They don't have access to information. They're not unmonitored. There are no technology solutions. Maybe they're the company that feeds the fish, right, during the day, and make sure that the common areas are properly maintained, that type of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So, so then you've identified the vendors, and what we've seen happening, just to share a little bit from our side, is that a lot of the end users are these small businesses. They're receiving these questionnaires, especially on the cybersecurity side, these cybersecurity assessments, and they come in a whole bunch of different formats and styles. We've seen some that are 30 questions long in an Excel. We've seen some that are 150 questions long. I spoke with a 200-person business the other day who said that they received one that was hundreds of pages long. It was they were like, "Wow, this is crazy." What can a small business expect, and what's inside of those questionnaires that you can share with the listeners here?
So a few things about the 100-page assessment. When you take a look at I shouldn't say large enterprise, when you take a look at any enterprise that distributes a vendor risk assessment, right, or a vendor facing assessment, which is what we're talking about, if they're not performing sort of the pre-due diligence on the vendor, and they don't really understand, or if they're not scoping that vendor assessment to really reflect the products and services that are being provided, then unfortunately it's the vendor who's on the wrong side of that bad process. And that's how you get these really huge assessments. But the thing is they send them to you, and now you have to do something with it, right? And by the way, I'm not a cheerleader for big business sending out 1,500 question assessments to a vendor, distributing off-the-shelf software or supporting business functions without any access to sensitive information. So I do think that a lot of organizations could do a much better job concentrating on the necessary and scoping those questionnaires to appropriately reflect the services attached to the vendor, right, which is what I was referring to earlier. So here's the thing. When you receive one of those assessments, you have a few options that are available to you. One, if the majority of the information is not consistent with the products or services that you're providing, take an opportunity to pick up the phone and let them know that, and ask them to scope the assessment appropriately. That's the first thing you can do. That, or you can answer not applicable, hundreds of times if necessary. But what you have to expect is that the risk management function, the third-party risk management function at that organization, is probably overloaded themselves. And so I'm not sure how much support you would receive from that vendor in those cases. So the best thing that a vendor can do is really pre-plan for any assessments that might come over to them, and there are a number of ways that that you can do that. And if you want to talk about that, we can certainly go there.
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that because we hear so often about these small businesses just getting caught off guard. I spoke with one the other day with our team who had said to us, "Hey, I've got this 150 questionnaire, and the interesting part is we've already signed the agreement for us to do work at this customer site, and they've now stopped all work and said you've got to complete this in order for us to proceed." And just totally caught off guard. So, is it basically checking the boxes, getting cybersecurity in place, building a program like this questionnaire, just to share a little bit, it was pretty detailed. It was asking about, do you have technology and data use policies? Do you have an incident response plan? Are you training your team? Do you conduct phishing simulations? Tell us about the different technologies you have in place. It had a list of a whole bunch of different technologies as well, and they wanted all of this information from this small business.
Yes, and we've seen those at CastleHill. We receive those as well,
right,
all the time.
Sure.
And again, they're not always consistent with the products and services that we're providing. So let me tell you what CastleHill does in those cases, and maybe that'll be helpful for some of the listeners. We understand that we're going to receive a lot of interest from vendor risk organizations because, again, we deploy SaaS solutions, on-site solutions. We have consultants in some sensitive areas. So what we try to do is plan for the occurrence that will happen, which is the vendor-facing assessment. And so in order to do that, we have created a standard response package. And in that standard response package, we provide them with all of the information from a supporting documentation perspective that they would typically need to make a good decision about how to proceed with CastleHill going forward. So we show them our information security policies. We show them our penetration testing results. We will show them our vulnerability scanning reports. We will provide them with SOC documentation for any of our third-party providers who are data handlers like AWS or Microsoft Azure, folks like that. And we will have already filled out some of the industry standard assessments, such as the CAIQ, which is used for evaluating cloud-based service delivery, SaaS solutions, that type of thing, and what's referred to as a SIG Lite. Okay, and there are many versions of the SIG Lite. The one that we use currently is the 2019. If you've built out responses up front for both of those standards and provided a stack of supporting documentation that's referenced in your answers, then generally speaking, there's very little else that you should have to do going forward. You may have to fill in some gaps or some special requests. A lot of times, the organization that is evaluating a small business will accept those types of responses in lieu of whatever their standard is. And if not, then there's another path that you can take. But I'll leave it there. The key is to know that they're coming and to plan in advance and have a really good package waiting as a standard response, and then work through the issues of whether or not the requester is satisfied with that response or not.
Yeah, that's excellent. Get the checks and balances in place, and then be prepared for that, because there has been a huge increase in the number of these coming to small businesses. Would you agree with that statement as well? It
Absolutely.
seems like a massive uptick lately, especially.
Yeah, and I think it's going to get worse before it's going to get better in terms of volume. Again, they're extending out past financial services, which used to be their focus. Now they're looking at everybody. And again, they're doing that for a lot of reasons, most of them good. The thing is that there's no real standard way to engage in these interactions between vendors. I should say requesters and responders is the generic term, right? There's really no standard way. A lot of folks out in the industry have tried to create standards for this, but they all fall short in one way or another.
Right. And so what happens if you're a small business, you receive one of these assessments and you know, haphazardly start, answering them not the way that you really should, just, I don't have that and I don't have this and so forth, and you shoot that back. What happens to that small business? What would the enterprise organization say to them? Would they just stop doing business with them, or would they give them an opportunity? I know it's probably different in each group, but what are you seeing?
It depends on your relationship with the requester. So if you're a small business and you get something, dropped in your lap that's, 1,000 questions, and you're just trying to put any response out there that you can, there are probably a couple of different outcomes to that. Again, it depends on your existing relationship. But one, they may just return back to you and say that it's not sufficient, in which case now you'll have to go back and do something again that you've already started. They may decide that if you already have a contract with the requester, they may choose to not renew that contract until the appropriate response has been received, right? So that's sort of the stick approach. They may take any gaps in your response and add them to some type of an issues platform, right? So now you're a company, you're working in the organization. They've logged all these issues against you that tracks against things like vendor performance, for example, which is a separate fork in the whole vendor relationship piece. And now you'll have again issues when it comes time to renew a contract potentially. So generally the outcomes aren't very good when you try to do something like that. Again, your best option is to answer it the best that you can, and then on top of that, provide them with your standard response package, which we talked about earlier. Generally, that mitigates any of the real negatives through that type of an interaction.
Yeah, I think where we're going with all this is really supporting the fact that small businesses, especially on the cybersecurity side, need to get their programs in place and get things running, because when your best customer sends you one of these and you don't have the check boxes checked,
right.
You're not in a very good position to scramble at that point in time and try to get things resolved immediately. It's a big challenge.
Right.
I've got a question for you. It's interesting if you turn it the other way around. And you think about that the enterprise organizations are sending these assessments and they have a lot of very sensitive questions. The one assessment, another one that I was looking at the other day, had in it actually asking what specific technologies were installed, what was the model and the make of that product, on what devices was it installed. Like really, that's a lot of sensitive information about the cybersecurity posture of that small business that's being sent to a big organization who's going to store that somewhere. Any thoughts about that? So we're sharing back and forth sensitive data in both organizations. I guess there needs to be trust in both directions.
There does. This is the trust but verify problem that we have in the industry. When they're asking those types of questions, and I have all types of opinions about why they're asking those types of questions and why maybe they shouldn't be asking those questions.
Yep.
But they are asking those questions. So why are they doing that? Typically what you have is in a lot of organizations, especially large organizations, the folks who are tied to the third-party risk management program are IT. And as a result, you tend to get a lot of very IT-centric questions. And IT folks, by their very nature, are analytical. Yeah. So you'll find a lot of these very granular questions. The thing that you have to wonder sort of out loud is, if they're asking this information and you're answering it, well, are they really looking at it? Are they really evaluating it, right? So what are some of the reasons why they would evaluate it? Well, we know that certain software has specific vulnerabilities. Certain hardware has specific vulnerabilities. So what they may have is an identified risk with a particular piece of software or a particular operating system or a particular piece of hardware that they have to mitigate through their through their control programs, through their IT control programs. That might be why those questions are there. But you're right, it is sensitive, and a lot of times, unfortunately, the person who's answering the assessment on behalf of the responder, the vendor, they probably won't know that information. And so then this is one of those instances where the granularity of an assessment sent to a small business where it's not applicable, that's something where maybe you want to pick up the phone and have a respectful discussion about maybe what's really in scope and what isn't. It doesn't hurt to pick up the phone and talk to the folks on the other side. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain by doing that.
Yeah, I love that. Open communication, especially with your customers, so vitally important. So we know that the enterprise organizations are doing these assessments. How do you feel about small businesses doing that for their own customers? So let's say you're running a 100-person manufacturing plant. Should you be doing that with your vendors as well?
Well, again, on some level, you probably should, because you shouldn't be, for lack of a better word, you shouldn't be ignorant of the risks that your vendors bring to your organization. And, it may not actually even be like a cyber risk. Say, for example, if you're manufacturing, you need to evaluate your vendors and understand what your resource and concentration risks are, right? Dependencies on third parties for, critical raw materials, for example. That's actually a big problem in the small business market. If you're single sourcing, well, you probably want to understand that and put a plan in place. That's when the results of your vendor-facing assessments are used appropriately for strategic decision making, down the road. But even if you are a small company, look, there's the CFPB is out there, and they are very diligent in protecting the interests of consumers. And so if you're a small business and you do have consumer information, chances are, if you're shipping products or if you have a relationship with that customer that involves some type of non-public information or personally identifiable information, you actually do have a requirement to understand, if you are sharing that information with another third party, what they're doing to protect it. So there are some reasons why you would want to do it for strategic reasons. There are some reasons why you would want to do it for practical reasons. And even if you're a manufacturing company, there are some reasons why you might want to do it for legal reasons or liability reasons.
Yeah, you jogged my memory while you were talking there about, a manufacturer that I met with who was explaining to me that one of their vendors, who was also a manufacturer making a piece of equipment that they included in their stuff, was hit with ransomware, and that actually infected their entire plant. And so this vendor they used was shut down for weeks. And I sort of thought, as you started going through that, wondering, does this original vendor, the manufacturer, were they ever thinking that, hey, if my customer could get shut down for weeks, now what do I do? Because when I asked them the question, so what'd you do? They said, it was not easy. We scrambled and tried to find another vendor who could provide us that same solution. It shut us down for a long time, and it was not a good situation. But that's just another aspect of risk, and shows a little bit how cybersecurity and supply chain and everything all just come together in one. So
they do, and that's actually not uncommon, unfortunately, or those types of issues.
It's happening all over.
Yeah.
So Justin, tell me. So this has been excellent. Some really wonderful information. Do you have any other tips for small businesses that they should be thinking about in regards to perhaps risk assessments for themselves, or the possibility of getting third-party risk assessments from their vendors? Any last thoughts?
Well, let's tie it up this way. Internally, there's a lot that a vendor can do to prepare for these assessments. I'm going to go back to saying that your best bet is to perform one of those vendor assessments internally, and then take a look at the gaps where you have to say no in some areas, and say, well, what do we have to do internally so that we can say yes to this question? A great exercise is to take the SIG Lite 2019 and run through that and see where your gaps are. And then if you're missing any of the policies or procedures that are referenced in the SIG Lite, well then go ahead and make those part of your policies and procedures internally. It's simple. It's simple to do that. So that's one thing internally. Understand that they're coming. Make sure that you have records of previous answers so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time an assessment comes in, even if that means having them on a spreadsheet. Make sure that you are doing the things that you need to do. So you know that you're going to be asked for penetration testing. Do penetration testing. It's not very expensive. You know that you're going to be asked for vulnerability testing. So do the vulnerability testing. It's not very expensive, right? There are a lot of things that a vendor will be asked to provide, and it doesn't take a lot of overhead to do those things in advance of the request. So that would be my biggest piece of advice. Do the little things, right? And remediate any issues that pop up as a result, and prepare yourself to provide them with a good response when you're asked for one. And communicate with the requester.
That's excellent. Well, Justin, thanks so much for your time. Great conversation, and I think the listeners are going to take a lot of great things back.
Excellent. Well, thanks for asking. I appreciate it.